All right, so for today, we're going to do day one of lesson 6. Let's start with the do now. It asks you, what is text structure? What are some examples of text structures? At this point, this should be review. You can also look around the room for an anchor chart. Please answer both number 1 and number 2. Please pause here to do so now. Today we're going to be reading pages 38 to 42 in Patient Zero. There are 4 sections that you're going to be reading. The first one is called Know Your Enemy. The second one, The Grand Experiment. The third, The Great Debate, Miasma versus Germs. And the fourth one, The Search Broadens. For each section, or after each section rather, I want you to pause and write a gist statement in this document. Let's begin with page 38, Know Your Enemy. All right, Know Your Enemy on page 38, bottom of the page. Dr. John Snow had been studying cholera for more than 20 years. When he was still training to become a doctor, John had been sent to the town of Killingworth in northern England to help miners who were dying from a cholera epidemic. He was appalled by the terrible conditions in the mines, and he suspected that they were linked to the disease outbreak. In a letter to his family, he wrote, "The pit is one huge privy, and of course the men always take their victuals with unwashed hands. We now know that cholera is spread when infected fecal matter gets into food or water, but at the time, no one understood this." So, in this section, he's talking about how they use one huge privy, which is like a toilet. So everybody's going to the bathroom in the same place, and they are eating without first washing their hands. Page 39. The accepted explanation was that cholera was caused by miasma, a fog of infected air rising from piles of garbage and sewage. John disagreed. How could bad air cause the severe diarrhea he'd seen among the cholera-stricken miners? Since the disease affected the digestive system, he suspected that cholera was caused by something you ingested, something in food or water. So when you ingest something, it's something that you eat or drink. A lot of people thought that cholera was being caused by this like poopy air that you were smelling and getting sick from, but he thought otherwise. At first, John kept his suspicions to himself. After all, he hadn't even finished medical school yet. He knew his ideas would be laughed at, but he didn't forget about them. He waited for an opportunity to prove his theory. By the 1840s, Dr. John Snow had a thriving medical practice as one of the world's first anesthesiologists, a specialist who gives patients medication so they don't feel pain during surgery. Sleeping gases, chloroform and ether, had been discovered that, when inhaled, made people temporarily unconscious. This was a breakthrough for surgeons and patients. Before the discovery of ether, surgeons had to operate on people who were fully awake. It was so terribly painful, sometimes patients would leap off the operating table in the middle of surgery and try to escape. John invented a regulator to deliver a safe, steady flow of gas to patients. He became so famous for his skill that he was asked to give chloroform to Queen Victoria during the births of 2 of her children. John's growing knowledge about the properties of gases made him even more convinced that miasma couldn't be the cause of cholera. He learned how concentrated the dose of chloroform and ether had to be in order to put patients to sleep, even briefly. So it didn't make sense that clouds of bad air could infect people throughout an entire city. And if bad air was really causing cholera, why didn't everyone develop the disease? The theory of miasma seemed full of logical inconsistencies, but he had no way to test his suspicions. Then cholera came back. A new epidemic of the disease was sweeping Europe, and in the spring of 1853, a year before the Broad Street outbreak, the disease hit South London, the part of the city that lay along the south bank of the River Thames. Still, no one understood what caused cholera or how it spread. Theories abounded. Some speculated that the people in the poor neighborhoods along the river were morally susceptible. Defects in their character made them prone to developing cholera. The miasmatists insisted that it was the smell from the neighborhoods and the river that caused the disease. John Snow started wondering where the people along the river got their drinking water. Please pause here and write down a gist statement. This would be for the very first section, Know Your Enemy. You want to focus your just statement on miasma, what people thought about miasma. The next section is called the Grand Experiment at the bottom of page 40. There was only one way to find out, by asking. So that summer, on his own, in his evenings and on weekends, John Snow went from house to house in South London, knocking on doors, inquiring how many people in each home had gotten sick and how many had died. Then he would follow up with an unexpected question. Do you know which company supplies your water? In the neighborhood south of the river, most people no longer got their water from public pumps, but had it piped in from the River Thames. There were two private water companies supplying that part of London, Lambeth and Southwark and Vauxhall. While Lambeth piped in water from a relatively clean part of the river upstream, Southwark and Vauxhall drew their water downstream from the main sewer lines, which poured the city's waste into the water. Would that difference affect who got sick? John Snow suspected it would. Significantly, there was no predictable pattern to the water supply system. One house might be supplied by Lambeth, while all its nearest neighbors got water from Southwark and Vauxhall. If John could show that cholera struck only the homes supplied with dirty water, it would be strong proof that miasma was not the cause. He hoped that this grand experiment would establish once and for all that cholera was spread through contaminated water. Before John could complete his investigations, the Broad Street outbreak began. Could he apply the techniques he had been using in South London, find the source of the outbreak, and do it fast enough to halt the epidemic or to stop it from spreading beyond Soho? He knew he had to try. Please pause here and write a just statement about John's theory regarding contaminated water and its connection to cholera. The next section is called The Great Debate, Miasma versus Germs. This one is going to be on page 41. It's one of the feature pages with the blue border. Today, it seems odd that so many people, including most doctors, believe disease floated around us in invisible clouds called miasma. How did this idea get started, and why did people believe in it for so long? The term miasma comes from the ancient Greek word for pollution. Miasma was thought to be a poisonous mist or vapor rising up from rotting garbage and organic matter. Even the word malaria, for instance, comes from the Italian mal aria, literally bad air. By the 19th century, nearly everyone equated bad smells with disease. Even after scientists like John Snow and later Robert Koch, who in the 1880s was the first to identify the bacteria that causes cholera, proved that germs, not miasma, were the sources of disease, many people refused to change their opinions. Florence Nightingale, the founder of modern nursing, believed until the day she died in 1910 that miasma was the source of many diseases, and she championed cleanliness, hygiene, fresh air, and sunshine as ways to prevent and cure disease. Nightingale's emphasis on the importance of high standards of hygiene in hospitals has saved millions of lives, and she was right that there is a connection between poor sanitation and the diseases such as cholera and typhoid. But the connection is germs, not smells. So, miasma was widely believed and accepted for a very long time until they were able to prove that it was the bacteria in contaminated water that was causing cholera. Please go ahead and pause here to write a just statement for page 41, The Great Debate, Miasma versus Germs. The last section we will read for today is The Search Broadens on the page 42 at the bottom. John marched up and down the streets of Soho, taking samples from all the local pumps. He hoped he'd be able to identify some contaminant. But when he got the vials of water home, they all seemed to be clear. John wasn't easily discouraged. He took to the streets again, knocking on doors, asking the same odd questions. Has anyone in this house had cholera? Where do you get your water? Over and over, he heard the same answer: the Broad Street pump. There were a few places that had escaped the epidemic, but even these exceptions seemed to point back to the pump. Just around the corner from Broad Street at 50 Poland Street, there had been only 2 deaths reported at the St. James Workhouse, a charity home for more than 500 of Soho's poorest men, women, and children. Why had the cholera hardly touched these residents while killing so many of their neighbors? The answer was that the workhouse had its own well, right on the premises. The other location in the neighborhood that seemed to have been passed over by the epidemic was a brewery on Broad Street. When John Snow asked the brewery owner where his workers got their water, he learned that they were given a ration of beer every day and drank that instead. By now, John was convinced that the Broad Street pump was the source of the outbreak. But there was one death he couldn't account for. Susanna Ely, an elderly woman living across town in the Hampstead Heath neighborhood, had died of cholera on September 2nd. The date put her right in the midst of the Broad Street outbreak, yet what could her connection to the Soho epidemic be? With a few more questions up and down Broad Street, John got his answer. Susanna's son operated the Ely percussion cap factory on Broad Street. Every day they sent their mother a jug of cold water, fresh from the Broad Street pump, because she insisted that Broad Street had the best tasting water in all of London. Susanna Ely's love for the water from the Broad Street pump had been fatal. So Susanna Ely believed that the water from the Broad Street pump tasted much better than the water near her home that supplied her house. Now, it did have a distinct taste, probably because of the contaminant, which happened to be fecal matter, or in other words, poop. Go ahead and write a gist statement in your document for the search broadens. When you are done, you can complete the rest of your document for today.